Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar will be Trauma-Informed Legal Advocacy, an Introduction. Our trainer today will be Rachel White-Domain, JD, Policy Manager for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using this Webinar System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen as well. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the Center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you want to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, type in the program that you're calling from, and then press Enter. Excellent. Perfect. We see that that's working. Y'all can continue to do that if you like. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says Chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a Media Viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email that you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that becomes a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call the WebEx tech support line to resolve any additional issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Rachel.
All right, thanks, Erin. Thanks very much. This is Rachel talking, and we're just going to do a sound check here as we get started. Thanks, everybody, for joining today and for calling in and for writing where you're coming from. It's nice to see people calling in from all over the country. We've got a lot of people on the line. And I just really appreciate so much that you all took your time out of the day to join us today. I'm going to get to talk a little bit about trauma-informed legal advocacy, which is a project that has been really important to me. Is that working okay for sound? Sorry, we're just doing a sound check here. All right. Yeah, so the webinar today is on trauma-informed legal advocacy. And what I mean by that is applying a trauma-informed and domestic violence approach to the way that we support particularly survivors of domestic violence as they engage with the legal system. And really a lot of the work that we do here at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is really thinking about how we can apply a trauma-informed approach to doing domestic violence work. But there's something really particular, there's something really special about doing work with survivors of domestic violence as they engage in the legal system. And the idea for this project, the Trauma-Informed Legal Advocacy Project, really came from my own pro bono work with survivors of domestic violence and really starting to figure out and trying really hard to figure out how to apply the work that I was doing here at the Center on trauma-informed approaches to working with survivors. to the day-to-day work I was doing with survivors of domestic violence, including in the jails and prisons here in Illinois. And I really wanted to think about that both from a framework perspective of what does it mean philosophically to take a trauma-informed, domestic violence-informed approach to our work with survivors, but also what does it mean on the ground? What are the practical strategies for applying a trauma-informed, domestic violence-informed approach to our work with survivors of domestic violence? And that's whether you're doing that as a legal advocate or if you're doing that as an attorney. And so the TILA project really hopes to speak to all of those experiences. So we'll get started. I just want to say a word about our funders. Our organization, NCDVTMH, is a National Special Issue Resource Center, and we're actually funded from the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, which is it's really the primary source of federal funding for emergency assistance for domestic violence survivors. And we're one of a handful of national special issue resource centers that are funded really to support the work of domestic violence field. And our focus area is obviously around trauma and mental health. That's really the work that we do, both in terms of what does it mean to take a trauma-informed approach specifically to domestic violence, but also thinking about how we can support collaboration between the domestic violence field and the behavioral health field in ways that are safe and trauma-informed for survivors of domestic violence. So that's really where we sit in the world of things. And I'm just taking a look here how to do this slide. So we'll go ahead and get started. And the place that I want to start is just to recognize that we work with people who've experienced and who continue to experience a lot of violence in their lives. And we may know that from the perspective of, all day, every day, we're working on petitions for orders of protection. All day, every day, we're working on divorce petitions. And the reason that we're doing that and the reason we're working on VAWA petitions or U visa petitions, for example, is because we know that the people that we work with have experienced a lot of violence in their lives. But the webinar that we're on today, what we're going to focus on is what it means to be working with folks who've experienced a lot of violence in their lives in terms of how that affects our ability to work together and how that affects folks' interactions with the legal system itself. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. And in a way, what that really means is balancing both the physical and the emotional safety needs of the folks that we're working with. It may often be that the legal system that we're interacting with is our goals in interacting with it may be in part to meet physical safety goals, that we have with our clients. And meanwhile, we're holding on to the ways to think about emotional safety for the folks that we're working with. So this is the place we're starting today. In this next slide, you can see this image is one of the ways that I like to think about this is that there's certain things that might come up in the course of our work, and really all of the TILA project is based around scenarios or questions that folks have asked me about how they can apply a trauma-informed approach to their work with survivors who are involved in the legal system. So I'd like to start from the place of what we might see with the folks that we're working with. And we might see people who are experiencing a lot of different needs, a lot of different ways of communicating, ways of engaging with the world, and ways of surviving the world. And if we don't have a framework for that, it can be really frustrating, or we may not know why we're seeing some of the things that we're seeing. One of the reasons might be we look at the impact of trauma. It can be one of the things that's impacting beneath the surface what we're seeing come up for folks. And we need a framework for how to think about that. So the term trauma-informed, if you know, was actually coined by Maxine Harris and Roger Fallett in 2001. And the concept was really to shift from a perspective of what's wrong with you to a perspective of what's happened to you. So our definition of trauma-informed that we're going to build off of or start from is an understanding of the pervasiveness and the impact of trauma, and a commitment to developing the knowledge and skills necessary to minimize re-traumatization. And so this actually, if you know some of the history, and we think back about when trauma was first thought about in the behavioral health system, it's actually back in 1980 that post-traumatic stress disorder, which now we think about as a pretty narrow way to think about trauma, but it was landmark at the time because it represented the first diagnosis to recognize the role of an external event in a person's mental health or well-being. So it was a monumental point in time back in 1980 when PTSD was first recognized and added to the DSM, recognized as part of trauma was recognized as part of that diagnosis. But it actually wasn't until 2001 that the word trauma-informed first came into being. And that was the concept that it's not just thinking about how trauma might impact a person's mental health and well-being and thinking about that in the context of therapy, for example, but also thinking about how all of our actions as service providers can impact the well-being of the person that we're working with, and being thoughtful about not re-traumatizing someone, but also really being an ally to them as they chart their own path towards healing and resiliency. And just to bring sort of, if you think about this as threads kind of winding themselves together, when we think about individuals experiencing domestic violence, trauma is not only in the past, it's also something that's ongoing. And so the actions and responses that may be coming up for the folks that we're working with may also be representing the ways that they're actively surviving in the world today. And so we're holding not just an awareness of how past trauma may have impacted the folks that we're working with, but also an understanding of how ongoing violence may impact folks' decisions and folks' options in the world and the ways that they're engaging with us as well as the legal system. And so just to build out a little bit that framework of what we might see on the surface and the different ways that folks are communicating, interacting, surviving the world, there's maybe a lot of things that we don't see that are beneath the surface, including the impact of trauma, but also including the impact of ongoing coercion, including by perhaps an intimate partner, and domestic violence, the impact of ongoing poverty, oppression, and community violence, and the strategies that that person has used to survive and respond. And again, if we don't have a framework for this, we might find ourselves with a lot of frustrations about the person that we're working with. But the other important thing to keep in mind here is that we want to be able to hold with equal respect all of the possible things that could be going into what we're seeing on the surface. And so we're thinking about not just thinking about with respect the things that can come up around trauma, but also really having a deep respect for the fierce ways that people have figured out how to survive in their world. And so this is our modified definition of trauma-informed, thinking about both an understanding of the pervasiveness and the impact of trauma and a commitment to developing the knowledge and skills necessary to minimize re-traumatization, but also how are we going to support healing and resiliency in an ongoing way, and how are we going to address the root causes of violence in our world. And so that means that we're actively working in our lives, both in our own lives, in our own individual work, in our own individual practice and behavior, but also in the wider world to advance addressing the root causes of violence. And so when we think about that, that's really what it means to have both a combined trauma and social justice perspective on the work that we do and in our own lives and in our approach and orientation to the broader world. So what does that mean for legal advocacy? So we're taking all those big concepts and we're thinking about how they apply to our work on a day-to-day basis, working with survivors of domestic violence who are involved in court processes in a number of different ways. And the project of the trauma-informed legal advocacy work is to start to answer that question. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to work on 3 different scenarios. But in doing that and looking at each of those scenarios, all of which have come up from questions that folks working in the field doing legal advocacy work or working as attorneys in the field have asked about how we apply this trauma-informed social justice approach to their work. So we're going to take those scenarios and we're going to take each of them and do a 2-step analysis. First, looking at what might be coming up for the person that we're working with. And then second, thinking about really concrete and practical strategies for how to respond. And what I'd like is for this 2-step analysis to become almost muscle memory, so that you're thinking, when you see something come up, then you have that initial reaction to someone, you're really stopping and thinking both, what's the framework that I can apply here? And then second, what are some of the tools in the toolbox that I have to respond to what's going on right now? Before we do that, I just want to take a moment and think a lot about, you know, we're legal advocates and attorneys and maybe other folks that are doing work with survivors involved in the legal systems. And so what really are our goals here? We're not therapists and we're not working with someone in that context. And what really are our goals as we're working to support someone involved in the legal system? And these are my thoughts, and you all might have other things to add to this list of things about what's our goals as legal advocates and attorneys But my thoughts are that first it's just to ensure that our services are both trauma-informed and accessible. And what I mean by that is that the services, we talked a little bit about trauma-informed, but also that we're thinking in a broader way about everything that could be happening from someone's perspective. So we're not drawing lines between what might be connected to past trauma and what might be, sometimes I hear language that I don't prefer around what's just a mental health condition. And that sort of creates a division that's not as helpful to us. So we want to be thinking more is about how do we ally with folks that are coming to us with a variety of different experiences that we might not understand. We want to make sure that our services are trauma-informed and accessible to folks who are also experiencing psychiatric disability or who might be experiencing substance use or addiction. We need to work efficiently, and often we're working under conditions that are less than ideal. So our work in the legal system may require us to do things that are not ideal from a trauma-informed perspective. We do need to know, there may be a lot of instances, in fact most instances is what I would offer to you, that we don't need to necessarily know all of what's going on beneath the surface for someone. But there are occasions in the context of working with someone in the legal system, if we're representing someone as their attorney, for example, that we will need to find ourselves needing to ask about, for example, past mental health diagnoses, so that we know what we need to be prepared for in a custody proceeding. And so when we do that, we need to know how to do it respectfully. We need to know when it's relevant in the first place to ask about. We also need to be able to identify and articulate safety concerns. And folks may come to us with a lot of different concerns, some of which are relevant to what we're trying to do in the legal system, and some of which may be less relevant. And always we're balancing emotional and physical safety. So I mentioned a little bit earlier this idea that there may be some things that the legal systems require, for example, to get an order of protection that may be contrary to ideas of emotional safety. So we're always balancing those things as we're working to support someone in the legal system. And of course, offering referrals as appropriate is another job that we have as an advocate working in the legal system, is to know what the community options are so that we can refer someone if that's something that they want and need. Our goals as legal advocates and attorneys do not include, obviously, diagnosing someone or trying to fix someone, certainly not to be anyone's therapist. There's a lot of really smart people that do those jobs, and those are not the jobs that we're trying to take on when we're thinking about how to do trauma-informed legal advocacy in our work. And I will note here that some of the things that we talk about here around providing trauma-informed accessible services can really take a lot more time and resources than it would to not worry about these things. And so, for example, one thing that comes up or that folks ask sometimes is that, sometimes folks come in for services and they've got a lot of different concerns and it just seems like they're all over the place, and it just takes a lot more time to, for example, complete a petition for an order of protection with them. And the thing that I think about from an accessibility standpoint is, for example, sometimes needing more time, taking more time with someone is a necessary accommodation. And when we think about that, we can remember that people who need accommodation, such as more time, it's possible also may be less likely to be able to access those resources without the advocacy that we're putting in. And so a really real example that I think about is I do work with survivors who are incarcerated, and being able to access legal materials or being able to access the law library or even being able to write back and forth with me can be really difficult for someone if they're not as good at writing or they're not as good at reading, or those bring up difficulties for them. The folks that have those barriers are going to be a lot less likely to actually access services that are going to help with their appeal, for example, than someone that doesn't experience those kind of barriers. And so we think about accommodations, even as basic as needing more time. We're really thinking about that as an accommodation that makes that person able to access that resource, whether that's access to filing a petition to order protection or some other kind of legal resource. And in domestic violence work, we also know that people with disabilities are also at a higher risk for violence, for experiencing violence. And so the impact that our work has when we're doing this work to really invest in making sure our services are more trauma-informed and accessible, the work that we're putting in to invest in that can really go a long way. So we're going to work on this first scenario here. And this first question is going to come up around traumatic triggers. The scenario that I'll present is all of a sudden that you're having trouble connecting with the person that you're working with. This might be for a number of different reasons. Maybe they've become agitated or frustrated, or maybe they're just completely shut down. And when that happens, how do we react? And so that first reaction might be one of frustration or might be one of anger. And this can be frustration at ourselves or at the person that we're working with, right? So we're going to take a moment, we're going to recognize that interaction, that reaction that we have to that person. And the first project that we're going to do is try to hold even our own reaction with compassion. And our reactions are going to be a little bit different every day, right? Some days we have more space, and other days we have less space. But what we'll do in our first step here, these are the 2 steps we're going to take at each of these scenarios that we work with today. The first step is just to take a moment and pause and think about what are all the things that could be happening from the perspective of the person that we're working with. And I have this little visual arrow to represent to you that we're taking this shift from what's wrong with her to what's happened to her. And that really represents a key part of trauma-informed work, is shifting from what's wrong with that person, sort of throwing out that question and saying that's not at all the right question that we want to ask. The question that we want to ask is really more what's happening from their perspective, whether that's something associated with trauma, something that's coming up as partly a trauma response, or for whatever other reason that something is not sitting right with someone or coming up in a hard way for someone. We're going to try to shift into thinking about what are all those possibilities that could be coming up for that person. And in this particular instance, some of the questions we might hold are, it's possible that they might be being triggered by something in the environment or an aspect of the environment or an internal sensation. And that can be happening both in our own conversation, our own interaction with that person maybe in our office, for example, or if we're meeting with them right outside of the courthouse. And it may also be that that's coming up in the court proceedings themselves. There's a lot of things that go on in court proceedings that can be triggering to someone. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Just real quickly to define what I mean by traumatic trigger. What I mean by that is a reminder of a traumatic incident that causes a person to re-experience some aspect of the incident as if it were happening in the present moment. And so it's not just remembering what happened, but actually re-experiencing some aspect on it on some level. So that re-experiencing can be a sensory memory, it can be a visual memory, but there's some aspect of what happened that feels like it's happening in the present moment. And we can be triggered by a number of things, by people, by smells, by someone's expression, and this is a really important one to keep in mind when we think about survivors of domestic violence or survivors of really any kind of interpersonal violence who may have experienced certain cues or facial gestures or even turns of phrase or words that indicate that something might be dangerous or unsafe. And so seeing those expressions or words or phrases may cause someone to experience a triggering reaction. Feelings or even dynamics in the room. So when we think about court proceedings, all of those dynamics that are happening, all of adversarial dynamics, for example, can be problematic for people. And how does this make us feel? So when we're triggered, it may be that we feel uneasy or anxious. You've probably heard that we might feel like on high alert or like we're watching out for something that might happen. We might feel afraid. We might get angry. It can also look like being physically ill or just being checked out. And importantly, folks may have some idea about what comes up for them, and they may not. They may or may not know either overall or in a specific moment what's going on for them or what might help. Or they may have a good idea of what things can be difficult for them and what kind of things come up. When we first learn about triggers, there's this idea that when we look at that list of all the things that could potentially be triggering to someone, sometimes there's the idea that we need to just stop and eliminate all the triggers. And it's certainly true that things like violent words that we use in our speech and violent imagery we should work toward eliminating those things. We have a responsibility to do that. We have a responsibility to make our environments accessible and culturally relevant and also trauma-informed, and part of that means removing things like that from our environment. But of course, it's impossible to get rid of all the triggers. That's not really the project that we're on. We're working towards creating space that is as physically and emotionally safe as possible but we're also working towards supporting people in managing their own trauma responses. That's part of the work that we're doing as well. So just to take a moment and think about what's really happening for someone when we have these kinds of trauma responses come up. What's actually happening is that our brain, which is to say the part of our brain that folks will talk about as the flight, fight, or freeze center, which is the amygdala, is telling our brain that we're in danger. And importantly, telling our brain that we're in danger and that there's really no time to evaluate the threat. There's no time to think through it in a slower way. And so our amygdala, which is the part of our brain that reacts most quickly to respond to a threat and to keep us safe, sending a message to our brain that there's some danger and we should react to it right away. But really there's more to it than that. And what I want to say about that is that when we have experienced a lot of violence in our lives, and when we've had to live under conditions where we constantly have to be keeping ourselves safe in a number of different ways, our brains change so that we're quicker to respond to those threats. And it may also be that we're responding to more types of things that are perceived as threats, more types of things that could be a cue that someone is unsafe or in danger. And it can also take longer for us to return to a state of calm. And so, for example, if, for example, we're walking along and we see this long green line maybe across our neighbor's yard or something, and for a moment we think it might be a snake, and so we jump up and we have a little reaction. We get a little bit afraid of that snake, especially if we're from the city and we're kind of a city girl and we don't see snakes very often. We see this garden hose and we jump for a second. And it may be that after realizing, oh, it's just a garden hose, we can come down pretty quickly to a state of calm. Or it may be that because we've had to do that a lot in our lives to respond to things that might be unsafe so that we can react quickly to keep ourselves safe, it may be that it will take us longer to come back to the place of calm that we want to be. Maybe that it actually takes us longer. And so when we think about folks that have experienced a lot of violence, particularly in walking through a legal system, for example, we think about all the possible things that could be cues that someone is in danger or someone is unsafe. It's not just that folks may be having trauma responses to all of those things. It may also be that folks are taking longer to come back down to the place of calm that they want to be. And so this is the part where I try not to impersonate a scientist on the air, so I usually show this video about neuroplasticity, and I won't do that today, but we'll send out the link to this little video later on so you can take a look at that. But what I want to say just for a moment is, recently, some of the more recent work in neuroscience is around this idea of neuroplasticity, which is that our brains are always changing, and our brains are actually rewiring in ways that we would talk about as healing. And so what I want to say about this is that a lot of folks knew, or a lot of us really knew about this idea of what now neuroscientists are calling neuroplasticity before we came up with that word, right? So we had a knowledge that healing was possible, and we had a knowledge that resiliency was important. It was an important part of our work and an important part of our politics. But now, as it happens, there's also some science behind this idea of neuroplasticity, which is that our brains can actually rewire in ways that we're reducing, for example, those high alert responses, in ways that we're changing, for example, negative thoughts we might have about ourselves and about the world as a result of trauma, guilt and blame, for example. And so it's not, when we talk about trauma, there's this danger that folks come away with this idea that either, if people have experienced violence, they may be affected in a way that they're damaged, and that's not at all what we're trying to say here today. What we're actually trying to say is something that's much more strength-based, but also this idea of resiliency is a critical part of talking about trauma. And it's something that we knew really before the idea of neuroplasticity came around, but it's also interesting to see the way that science has engaged with this concept. So we're going to shift to step 2 of this scenario. We're going to talk for a second about just the practical strategy. So we did a sort of zoom out. We looked at the philosophy of thinking about doing a trauma-informed, domestic violence-informed approach to working with survivors in the legal system. But now we're going to take a moment and think very concretely about what strategies we might be able to apply in this moment with this person we're working with who's having some sort of trauma response, or potentially having some sort of trauma response. I'm going to think about what might help in the moment. And this is a place where y'all can add, too, if you want to add additional comments. This project is definitely an iterative one, so you're all most welcome to add strategies that you might have as well for how to respond to these kinds of things. But the first one I'll offer to you is the importance of just observing and validating feelings. And this is something that we do, if you're a domestic violence advocate, this is something that you know a lot about and do in your work. Lawyers don't get as much of this in the training that we have. And I'll give you some model language for what it means to just observe and validate those feelings that could be coming up for someone. First, that sounds really scary or hurtful, or just that I appreciate you sharing that with me, even though it seems like or it looks like it's making you sad to talk about it. But the thing I want to say about this that's important is that we say these things not just because they're a nice thing to say. They sound nice and they sound like a nice thing to say in that moment. We actually say them for a very, very specific reason. And that's that, you know, when feelings like this come up in the context of an experience of violence, when we show feelings like being afraid or being scared or being hurt in the context of a violent interaction, those feelings are not met with interest, and those feelings are not met with respect and with care. They might be met with a lack of interest or even increased violence. And so when we're doing this work of noticing what's coming up for someone and really holding that and appreciating that and creating safe space for those feelings to come up, we're doing something that's countering the experience of abuse. It's actively countering the experiences of abuse. And in fact, every interaction that we have with someone, whether that's in the context of doing legal support work, doing legal advocacy, representing someone, even if our project is not one of working deeply with them on healing, our project is not certainly one of being their therapist, our project is one of doing legal support work with someone. But every interaction that we have with them, every interaction that we have with someone else, is an opportunity to be doing something that's counter the experiences of abuse, and that's counter the experience of oppression. And that's part of the work that we're doing. It's not just a trauma-informed approach, but it's also actively countering the experiences of abuse. And this is the part where, especially if I have a training with all lawyers, they start to think, you know, this is really not my job. I'm not a therapist. Dealing with emotions is just not really what I do. And so the piece that I want to offer to you is that all of these pieces really fit together. So this is a puzzle piece, and all of us are whole people. And the folks that we're working with may need support around navigating really complex legal systems. And they may also need support around emotional safety and around mental health and well-being. And that all of those pieces of the work need to fit together, puzzle pieces that need to fit together towards a holistic effort of safety and healing. And if the work that we're doing on one end with someone to support their legal goals is working in conflict with other things that that person might be trying to work on around healing, building their healing and resiliency, those things are working in conflict, then we're actually doing harm to that person, right? So what I want to offer to you is that this work should fit together like puzzle pieces. And again, every interaction that we have is an opportunity to counter the experiences of abuse. Second strategy that we can use here is just to take a moment and ask what would help. So for example, some model language. I know it's a lot. I know we're doing a lot and talking a lot about a lot of different things right now. And let's just pause for a moment. I'm noticing that it looks like this is a lot to talk about. And just let me know if there's anything that would help, and I'll follow your lead. And I'll tell you, I do work with survivors of domestic violence who are incarcerated. And I don't know that I've ever asked this question and had anybody say, oh yeah, actually what would help is if we talk for another exactly 15 minutes and then you go and get me a drink of water, and if you turn your chair at exactly a 45-degree angle, that's what would help. I don't think I've ever had anybody tell me that. And to tell you the truth, I don't really think that's the point. It's to get that exact piece of information. Not that, you know, any of us really know exactly what the thing is. It's going to make things feel okay or better. I think the point of asking this is to communicate that the person that you're working with is the person who has control over that interaction. And if there's things that you can do to make them feel more safe in that interaction, or to feel more respected, or to just go at the pace that they need to go for that interaction, that you're willing and committed to doing those things. You're willing and committed to building that relationship and to figuring out what those things are, and that you're willing and committed to take the lead of the person that you're working with. It's not necessarily to get an answer to this question. Yeah. And we've got just I'll bounce back to that one. Thanks, Nancy. So we also just had a comment. It's also helpful not to seem rushed or to watch the clock, to suggest water, coffee, or a bathroom break, right? So we're really communicating. What I like about that comment actually is that a lot of what we're doing, we're talking sometimes about really specific suggestions, but it's really the meaning behind the thing that we're doing that's critical and important. So when we're not looking at the clock, you know, you can put that out there as, oh, well, don't look at the clock, and it seems like just one of, like, all of my sort of lists of suggestions or ideas of things that you can do. But the importance and the significance of why that's sort of a good tip from Nancy here that just wrote in is because it's the meaning behind that thing that really matters, right? So we're not constantly looking at the clock. What we're communicating is that we really want to be fully present with that person, and we really want to spend all of the time that we can with that person. And what gets complicated about doing legal advocacy is that sometimes we don't have that choice. Sometimes we're literally 5 minutes before our hearing begins, and we know that we can't push it back, and we know we only have 5 minutes. And how do we hold that desire we have to make that 5 minutes not feel rushed, and at the same time acknowledge that it might be a reality that we only have 5 minutes to work with that person. And in thinking about that question a lot, what I've decided is that it really is about the meaning behind the thing that we're doing. And so in my own work, when I come up against those less than ideal conditions, when I get a phone call and I know that I have another one after and I can't be on the call as much as I can be, or when I know that sometimes folks will call me for things and leave a message, and it might take me a day or two or a couple days to get back to them because I've got other emergencies going on. I've come to believe that it's actually the meaning behind the thing that's the most important, really for all of us in our interactions with other people, but particularly when we're working with someone who's experienced a lot of betrayal in the relationships that they've had in their lives. And so what I like to think about is communicating my intention in all of those interactions. So for example, if I know that something's going to feel rushed, I'll say, you know, I really regret this, but I'm a little worried that our interaction is going to feel rushed today. And I just want you to know that it's not because I don't want to spend a lot more time with you. Or I just want you to know it's not because I don't care about your case. I care about your case a lot. And it's going to feel rushed today, and I want to acknowledge that to you. But it's only because I know that the guard is going to come interrupt us in a few minutes. But I don't want you to think that that means that I don't care about your case, or that I'm not committed to you, or that I don't believe you. So that's like a concrete way to think about working around some of those real constraints that come up in legal work in a way that they don't come up in some of our other work, perhaps. So I want to talk for just a second here about if someone seems completely checked out. So we're talking a little bit about different kinds of trauma responses, and I just want to talk about this one in particular for just a moment. And so we want to talk about dissociation, and I just want to give you some familiarity with that as a concept. But again, going back to that initial image of what we might see coming up for someone, it's not as important for us to figure out exactly what's going on for someone. And the purpose of today, if you remember back from our earlier slide on what our goals are and are not as legal advocates and attorneys, our goal is certainly not to diagnose someone. And in fact, diagnostic, having some sort of a diagnostic framework for this is really not going to help us do a better job of working with people in a trauma-informed way. What we need to have is a framework that can hold all these pieces with respect. Even if we don't know what's going on with someone, that's not really the most important piece. But I want to give you a little bit of insight into what dissociation does refer to so that you have some familiarity with that concept. What if someone seems completely checked out? Or what if someone is, when you're talking with them, maybe you're seeing someone have speech that starts to slow down or trails off, or they have a blank stare. And one of the questions that we might have is, it's possible that they might be experiencing something that some people talk about as a dissociative response. And what we mean by that is our experience of what is happening and our understanding of what is happening become disconnected. So dissociation is actually a protective coping mechanism that we may develop in response to situations, and it may develop over time in response to situations that we cannot otherwise escape or control. And the really important thing to know about dissociation is that it can be a response to being and a response to feeling that you're unsafe in that moment or that situation. And so that matters because it has a lot to do with how we respond to dissociation. So when we're thinking about grounding as a response that we can have if someone seems to be having seems to be having a response where they may be having a blank stare, they may seem checked out or just not totally present in that particular moment. The first thing that we always want to keep in mind before offering any sort of grounding or any sort of support to that person is that dissociation can be a response to feeling emotionally unsafe. And we may be, for example, in a courthouse where we're not entirely safe emotionally. It can be a difficult and trying and stressful environment. And so before we're doing any sorts of grounding work, we need to think about if there's any way that we can increase or be attentive to emotional safety in that environment. Second, these are Rachel's rules for grounding, and then I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by grounding. So always when we're doing grounding, we're offering and not imposing. So when I think about grounding, I think about throwing out maybe some options or some possible things that someone can take hold of if they want to, if they choose to, if they desire to in that moment. My third rule is always be classy and never be cheesy, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So grounding exercises to help someone return to the present. If you do sort of some research on grounding exercises, you'll see grounding exercises that focus on the body, and then you'll also see grounding exercises that focus on the exterior environment. And I do prefer to use grounding exercises that focus on the exterior environment because we're recognizing that being in our bodies can sometimes be what feels unsafe. And so we're going to take a little bit of distance from that. Probably the closest I would get is to say something like, I like your shoes, they look really comfortable. And I like that because it's offering something that is really offering. You're not seeing what's coming up for someone and thinking that, just because you saw a slide or two on dissociation that you know everything about that and that's definitely what's going on for that person and they definitely need to come back into the present immediately, and you are the person that knows how that person is going to be brought back into the present moment. But you're just noticing that someone is seeming a little bit checked out or a little bit less present, and you're just offering something that if they would like to use that to come back fully into the present moment, they can. And the reason for that, and the reason it's important to always be classy and never be cheesy with these kinds of things is, for example, like if you were going to talk to me about baseball right now, I might not be totally focused on what you're saying. And it may not be because I'm having a dissociation response. It may be, but it may also be that I really, really don't like baseball that much. It's not terribly interesting to me. And so I'm probably just thinking about something else. Or it may be that there's something about baseball that really, really brings up trauma responses for me. And I'm checked out in a way that's my own managing of the distance between myself and that thing that you're talking about. And I may not be totally ready. Or I may not feel totally emotionally safe to come back into the present moment, which is why we're offering and not imposing when we're doing grounding exercises. And particularly I'm thinking of, the work that we do in legal work, we're often working with someone that we don't have an ongoing relationship, right? So we may be working with someone that we just met that morning and we prepared a petition for emergency order of protection for them. If we have an ongoing relationship with someone and we know, for example, what kinds of things are helpful to them, that's kind of a different situation. You can figure out together what kinds of things would be helpful support to them. But if you don't know, you've just met that person, these are sort of these are guidelines to apply in that sort of situation. Yeah, Nancy also offers always be sincere, certainly. sincerity is critical, I think, throughout all of these exercises. So some other examples here, we could say, you know, these benches aren't very nice to sit in, but no one's going to bother us here. And I like that one because it incorporates an idea of, you know, we're okay here. This is a safe place for me and you to be as we talk about this case, or as we talk about what's going to happen when we go into that hearing, and maybe you're in the context of talking about that with someone and all of a sudden they start to seem like maybe they're getting a little bit checked out or they're not totally present with anymore. And you don't need to stop and call everything off and say, I think you might be not totally present, let's stop, you know, you can just shift a little bit the conversation and say, you know, I just have always hated these benches. They're just not very comfortable. But no one's going to bother us here. We can sit here for as long as we like. We can sit here together for as long as we like. Or what do you think of the colors in that painting? Another thing that you can offer is just modeling some breath. And I wouldn't recommend, in general, asking someone to do deep breathing because that itself for some folks can be triggering. So again, unless you know that that's something that is really helpful for someone and that's what they prefer for you to do if they're having that kind of response, I wouldn't necessarily suggest someone do really deep breathing unless you have that kind of relationship. But you can certainly model taking some slow, deep breaths and looking relaxed and communicating also in that way that you're safe in that moment and you can take some time together. So we'll take a moment here and talk a little bit about minimizing triggering. So we talked just in the last couple slides about responding if someone is having a trauma response come up. But what can we do in advance to minimize potential triggers in our own space? So first I want to talk about options in the physical space. And with regards to physical options, the first things I really think about are chairs and doors. And so for some folks, if you imagine an office space, so this is if you do actually have access to your own office space when you're working with someone, and you do have access to your own chairs and doors, really the key here is to maximize options for where people can sit in that space, chairs and doors. So for some folks it might be harder to have their back against an open door because you never know who's going to be coming in and they're coming up from behind you, and that's not always what you want. And for other folks it might be really important that you're not between them and the door, so if they want to walk out the door at any moment that they can do that. And so maximizing options in terms of where the placement of your desk and your chair are in the room so that folks have different choices about where to sit is really critical. But again, I work with people who are in the jails and in the prisons, and we certainly don't always have control over the furniture, if there is any, in the rooms that we're meeting with. And so I think it's also important to remember that your physical body is part of the physical space, and there's a lot that we can control and communicate even just with our own body in that physical space. So for example, when I meet with folks, there's usually a glass window so that the guards can see in and actually look at the person that I'm meeting with, and I usually discuss this with the person that I'm going in to meet, but I think about how my body can be positioned so that that person wants perhaps some privacy from the folks that can look in at her, that they are looking more at me than the person that I'm meeting with. So your body is part of the physical space. It's also that your body is one of the ways that we communicate. So using open body language, using relaxed body language is one of the ways that we can communicate in that space to that person that we're committed to creating safe, emotionally safe space. Explaining things in advance is sort of a classic or key tenet of trauma-informed work, the importance of explaining things in advance and avoiding surprises and things like that. And there's definitely a balance here between giving too much information as we're preparing someone for a court proceeding, giving someone too much information and not enough information. But I think the thing that I want to note here is that often when people think about what things we can explain in advance, they think about kind of the concrete structure, which is important certainly. They think about you know, maybe the building or the process. Well, you're going to file this, and then you're going to go to the second floor and you're going to file this. And what I like to think about explaining is the roles or the kinds of people that someone is going to encounter. So who will you encounter, and what are their roles going to be? So that part of that is not going to be a surprise or is easier to navigate. Certainly offering breaks as we're working through. And I don't mean breaks just in terms of do you want to take a break now and get a drink of water. I also think of breaks as passing back and forth from if we're working on some hard material, maybe it's also passing from the harder material back into something, segueing into something easier, and then coming back to it, especially if someone's brought up something and I prefer to ask earlier in the conversation. And again, I'm thinking mostly about meeting with survivors who are incarcerated. If there's anybody in here who you've really made friends with or connected with, just so I have that sense and I can come back to that later in the conversation if things get hard and folks maybe want a break, not necessarily let's both get up and go get a drink of water, but also let's take a break from some of the harder things that we're talking about for a moment and maybe just segue for a moment into something that is easier to think about or that can bring you some balance or bring you some presence into what you're thinking about. And finally, note-taking. So for folks who have been involved in systems that are not necessarily trauma-informed or systems that are actively traumatizing, the process of someone taking notes about you is sometimes one aspect of a really objectifying experience. And so I would offer to you to always be really careful, especially when you go to start taking notes about an interaction or about if you're doing a legal interview, for example. If I have a moment, I will ask if I can begin taking notes. And if you're working with someone who really just launches in and starts telling you a lot of information and it seems important that you capture what it is that they're telling you, I'll start taking notes, but I'll use open body language to keep those notes, for example, open on the table where they can see what I'm working on. And when I do have a chance, when there's a pause in the conversation, usually I'll take a moment and say, well, just so you know, I took some notes because I wanted to make sure I was capturing what it was that you were saying, and I basically wrote down and I summarized a little bit what it is that I wrote down about them so that they have control over that note-taking, and also so that they know the purpose of that note-taking, that they really have the meaning behind that, which is that I'm taking notes because I wanted to make sure I was fully understanding the concerns that you were raising to me, so that we don't get into this, we don't create those dynamics where we're objectifying someone or taking notes as part of an objectifying experience, which might be something that came up if they were involved in systems that were less trauma-informed. Yeah, so we'll take a moment and just think about, that's a good comment. Yeah, so from Diana, thank you. A lot of my victims find accuracy in note-taking to be very important. I oftentimes read back what I wrote to ensure my summaries captured their meaning. I like that a lot, and again, I note and I appreciate what you're saying about the note-taking being important and maybe communicating that it's important to you as their attorney or as their legal advocate or other person working in a supportive role, that I'm really capturing and understanding everything that you're saying. I'm taking the time to ensure that it's accurate. And yeah, definitely, that's definitely what we're doing. So we'll take a minute and think about some of the ways that we can prepare someone emotionally for a court proceeding. And one of those ways, as we talked a little bit about, is to offer a virtual tour. And if you've got time to go, for example, to a courthouse in advance and really do an in-person tour, if you're preparing for trial, for example, you might have time to go in and actually do a tour of the courtroom itself. But if you don't have time for that, it's always possible to offer a virtual tour, so to walk that person through, again, what it is that they might encounter as they walk through that court proceeding. The other thing we can think about is self-soothing strategies. So all of those things, if we're doing some planning with that person around what sorts of things are calming to you, or what sorts of things do you think you'd want to have available to you if trauma responses do come up in the context of the court proceedings. And it may, for example, be something like, oh, music. Music is something that is really centering and grounding to me. And of course, we can't take our music in with us to a court proceeding, but what we can do is we can memorize a line of a song or a line of a poem or a line of a prayer, and we can take that with us. And so the thing that I think about when I'm getting ready for a court proceeding is how to take what we already know about what is soothing to us and to try to make it travel size. So I think about when I was little and we would drive in a big, me and my sisters and my family in a big Suburban, and we drove all the way from Pennsylvania down to Florida, and we brought all these board games, and the board games were all travel size, and they were always missing all of their pieces. And I think about doing court prep in a similar way. So I think about all of the strategies that people have in their broader lives to help them self-soothe, and how to make those things travel size. So another example, I worked with a survivor once who found cloth and textured cloth to be really affirming. And so what we did was we just cut out a couple of squares of cloth to bring with us into the court proceedings, so she could just have that in her pocket and use that if she felt like she needed some extra support. Enlist supporters, certainly, ideally we'd have folks who are able to attend all of the court proceedings of the people that we're working with, and certainly that's not always possible. But what we can do in advance of court is have folks take a minute and think about all the people in their lives who they would like to bring with them into the court proceeding if they could, and that may be immediate family, that may be extended family, that may be ancestors, that may mean drawing an extended family tree so that we can bring all of those people with us in spirit into the court proceeding with us. And just taking a minute and thinking about all the people that you'd want to have surrounding or to have accompanying you when you go into court. Just that process itself can be really helpful in terms of planning for a court proceeding. Also asking about basic needs. So we think about even just in studying for the bar exam and how well we were doing it, just making sure that we were eating and we were sleeping and those kinds of things. And it's worth a question, especially if you're working with someone over time and there's a big court proceeding coming up, what they're doing to make sure that their basic needs are met so that they can be fully present when we arrive at court. And I think if I navigate over in terms of emotional safety planning, I've got a worksheet on that, which I think that you can see. If you can't, there's a tab that says preparing for court proceedings, which is this info and worksheet. And the idea of this is that if you're working with someone to prepare for court, you can work through this workshop either together with them or they can work through it on their own to think about what they might be able to expect, what could come up in the context of a court proceeding, and what kinds of planning they can do in advance, both things that they could do and things that others can do to help support them, and then making a what-if plan. So what-if plan, just thinking about emotional safety planning in the same way that domestic violence advocates are very skilled at thinking about physical safety planning. What kinds of things that you can do if you do find yourselves becoming overwhelmed or scared or checked out while you're at court, for example, while you're testifying. And then there's a sample what-if plan you could actually cut out there. So this is available on our website, and I think the link just got posted there, yeah. So you can take it and print it and print copies for your office if you would like. I'm just trying, Jen, to navigate back to the slides, and I might be having some freezing on this end. So I'm just going to see if that goes away in a second here. There we go. Okay. All right. So I'm back here on the slides. I'm just going to model some of the language that I might use if I was thinking of doing some emotional safety planning work for someone in preparation for court, and some of the language I might use for that. For a lot of people, going to court can bring up uncomfortable or scary feelings, and we can prepare for this just like we will prepare for any other part of the case. The other thing that we can ask about is substance use. So for many people I work with, so many people I work with tell me that they drink alcohol or pop pills or use something else when they are stressed out. And having to go to court can be really stressful. If this is something that you might be worried about, let me know, and we can make a plan to stay sober before court. And what I would offer to you is the importance of really asking this to everyone that we work with. I just recently heard a story when I was doing a training of someone who had been working with a survivor for a very long time and was preparing for a very important hearing and was doing all the right things around preparation and every meeting to prepare for her testimony. She was really upset and crying and had a hard time getting through all of her testimony. And when she went finally to this hearing that they were preparing for, she was very, very calm and collected. In fact, in such a way that she appeared to be checked out and didn't really have any emotional response to the facts that she was recounting to the judge. And as a result of that, her story was not taken very seriously. It wasn't perceived to be the right response that someone should have who'd experienced a lot of violence. And later the attorney found out it's because that she had self-medicated because she was so worried that she was going to cry and be upset on the stand, that she did self-medicate and take some kind of medication to allow her to be more that way. But as a result of that, it's not something they had discussed in advance. As a result of that, the way that she looked or appeared on the stand, the judge and the jury found to be not credible. And so talking about things like alcohol, popping pills, or using substances prior to court can be a really important part of preparing for court proceedings. So we'll pass now over to scenario 2. We're going to talk for just a moment around trauma, memory, and trust building. In this scenario, someone doesn't share important information during the preparation of a petition, in this case for a protective order, and it comes out later during a court proceeding or during a hearing. And this is something that I hear about very, very often. It's unfortunately something that I think happens a lot. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons that might happen and some of the ways that we can avoid that in the future. So first we'll do that noticing of some of the things that might come up for us, and we'll have compassion for our own reactions. It certainly can be frustrating. It's easy to be frustrated with the person that we're working with. We may also feel frustrated with ourselves for not having been able to do anything to make that not happen. But instead, we're going to shift into first question 1 of what could have happened from that person's perspective. And we're shifting from this question of what's wrong with her to what's happened to her. And from a trauma-informed perspective and a domestic violence-informed perspective, we know in our work that experiencing abuse, especially by someone who we should be able to trust, can make it very hard to trust people in the future. And we also know that the person that we're working with may also be aware of very real dangers, that the information that they shared could be held against them in court. And so sometimes the things that come up in a hearing later that didn't come up in the initial preparation are things that the person maybe just didn't think of for whatever number of reasons that we'll talk about in a moment. But it may also be that what wasn't shared was connected to something that was stigmatized. Maybe it was an experience of violence that was connected to using substances, or maybe it was an experience of violence that was somehow connected to something that's criminalized. And so when we think about when we're doing preparations with folks, folks have an awareness of the kinds of things that courts are really, really hard on. So that courts may be stigmatizing around things that are part of the real experiences of the people that we're working with. So it's really important that we're communicating that we don't share those same views and we don't share those same stigmas. We'll talk about that in a second. But just to give you some of that, for doing that first question of what are all the things that could have been happening for that person, especially if we didn't have a very long relationship with that person before we went up for the court proceeding, for the hearing. For example, if we were doing an order of protection with them just in the moments before they went up and spoke with the judge, we may not have had time to build the kind of relationship where they can be sharing everything that we ideally would want to talk about before we went up in front of a judge to ask for an order of protection, etc. But also, we also know that during a traumatic incident, our survival responses may cause us to focus more on some details than on others, or we may check out or dissociate during a traumatic event. And so what could be going on for that person could be some combination of things related to trust or not having thought about everything that they want to share with us because we don't have that relationship built yet, but it may also be related to not being able to access those details of what happened to them, at least not in the interactions that we were able to have up to that moment. And this can represent two different things. So this can represent some issues in the way that the information was taken in. We may remember, for example, some things in greater detail and some things not at all. But it can also impact the way that we recall or remember events. So sometimes traumatic responses can make it difficult for us to remember details later on or to access the emotions that we felt during that time. And it's also important to note that traumatic brain injury can impact our memory of past events. So So we may remember the event, but we may be avoiding at some level the experience, the feelings associated with that experience. And this is a chart from the Cedron Institute. I just want to focus on this for just a moment here. On the left-hand column there, you'll see some of the factors that are associated with having a continuous memory, so not having a disruption in your memory of a traumatic event. And some factors that make it more likely that we'll actually remember or have a continuous memory is, first, that it's a single traumatic event. And second, interestingly, that it's a natural or accidental cause. There's actually research that we're more likely to have a continuous memory of an event if the cause of the event was natural or accidental. If the person who experienced the violence was an adult at the time, and interestingly, if they received validation and support following the traumatic event. On the other hand, on the other side, on the right-hand side of that chart, we see factors that are associated with not having a continuous memory of the event. One of them is that it's an experience of violence that was repeated. And so when we think about our work with domestic violence survivors, most of them have experienced repeated incidents of abuse. If there's a deliberate human cause, if the person was a child or a young person when they experienced the incident, it makes it more likely that they will have developed dissociation as a way to respond to what's going on. And if denial and secrecy surrounded the event, that those factors actually make it more likely that we'll experience dissociation or that we won't experience continuous memory of the event. And so I just want you to have this in mind because the work that most of us are doing are with folks who have experienced not only interpersonal violence but also repeated experiences of interpersonal violence. So what this means for our work is just because someone doesn't share something right away or they share something new later, it doesn't mean that they were lying either then or now. It may represent a number of different factors, including not fully having trust in the relationship at the time that you were preparing, being worried about things being stigmatized or the court being hard on them about certain things, but also not fully being able to remember all of what was happening for a number of different reasons. Or maybe also concerns with regard to not being believed if they share certain aspects of a stigmatized experience. It's also important to note that folks may share information or share a lot of information early on in the relationship or early on in a meeting or a hearing, and then later you'll see folks maybe withdraw a little bit from the relationship or step back a little bit as if they maybe have felt that they had shared too much or felt maybe vulnerable from sharing too much information. So that's also something to look out for if we're working with someone over a period of time and we have an early perhaps interview or something with them where we felt like we actually got a lot of information, and then later on it seems that it's harder to have good communication with that person, that may be something that needs to be thought about and addressed. So we'll do some real concrete tips about how we can respond in this moment. And some of these suggestions are about transparency. So transparency is a key principle of trauma-informed practice. And transparency in the context of legal advocacy is both really important and really difficult, right? Because we have a lot of very real limitations on our time. And so transparency about those limitations, as we were talking a little bit about earlier today, transparency about the limitations that we have is a critical part of doing trauma-informed legal advocacy. And when we first talk about that, one of the things that might come to mind is letting someone know, for example, if we get on the call with them and we really only have 15 minutes, we don't have a whole hour to meet with them, and being transparent about those limits. But transparency about limitations is more than that. And again, that goes back to the concept of what's really the meaning behind that when we're saying something like, there's limitations on how much time I have today. And what we're really trying to do when we do that is to communicate with someone that the meaning behind that is not that I don't want to talk to you, and the meaning behind that is not that I don't think that your case is important. If I don't call you back for a couple days, the meaning behind that is not going to be that I don't want to work on your case anymore, that you said something to make me upset. in working with women who are incarcerated, I find that if I don't respond to letters for a little while, which I'm not always good at, sometimes I'll get a letter. Often I'll get a letter from someone saying, "I'm so sorry if there was something in the last letter that offended you." And that's never been the case. That's never been the case that the reason I didn't respond to a letter is because I was offended or there was something that made me think that I didn't want to work on their case anymore or didn't believe them anymore. But I can't tell you how often people have asked me that because I haven't responded or written back quickly enough to letters. And so what I mean by that, or what I'm trying to say by that, is that when we talk about our limitations in the time that we have to spend with someone, and our limitations on maybe also the role that we can play or what we can do with someone, what we're actually trying to do is provide that meeting, and provide that meeting that we're committed to working on someone's case, even if the context that we're working with, the limitations of our time and the limitations of our resource may make it seem like we're not fully committed to them. And it's really about communicating those limitations, but also being transparent about what you can and can't do. Transparency about our role is really about providing someone information about what kind of role that you play, but also why you're doing something and why you're not doing something. So, for example, one of the things that I like to be really clear about is that sometimes we, for example, have to ask questions that to me might be, if I'm meeting with someone, might not be the questions that I would necessarily ask someone the first time that I met them. Maybe they're asking about information that is sometimes stigmatized or just personal or private. For example, if they have what their entire mental health history has been or something like that. And so if I am required to ask questions like that, for example, because it's necessary for us to have a grant that we ask everybody these questions, I often or try as a practice to always tell folks why it is that I'm asking those questions. Especially if it's related to stigmatized information such as related to mental health, or if I'm asking because I want to be prepared for their case. So if I want to ask about, for example, a past history of mental health diagnoses and treatment, and the reason I want to ask is because I want to be prepared if the other side raises those issues in a way that's attacking us. I'll ask that in a way of putting that into context and saying, you know, when we go to hearing or when we go to trial, the other side might say the worst things that they could possibly think about to say about you. And so I want to ask you some questions about your past history of this or that. And the reason that I'm asking you that, is because I want to make sure that I'm as prepared as I possibly can be to work on this case with you. And so we're providing the meaning behind why we're asking about particularly stigmatized information. And also transparency about risks and realities. So that's what I was talking about earlier with, you know, it may be the case that the court or that other people believe this or that about something, but I don't believe that. And this is the language I'll model for that. A lot of people believe, for example, that if someone is drinking or using drugs when they're assaulted, then what happened to them is their fault. A lot of people believe that. Sometimes the courts believe that. But I want you to know that I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. And if something like that was part of your experience, you can tell me that, because I don't share that view. So when we're doing something like this, we're recognizing the risks and realities of the world. We're recognizing the risks and realities of sharing this kind of stigmatized information with the court, for example. But we're being very clear that I don't believe that. Another strategy in here is storytelling. So ideally, and some of these suggestions come from Mary Fabry, who's a psychologist that has done a lot of work with survivors of trauma in the context of doing refugee and asylum applications. And she has some materials or some guidance around how to do an interview in a way that helps support people's best memory of what happened. And her suggestion is to start by laying out what it is that you want to know from someone, and then giving someone as much space as you possibly can to explain explain their story, let them tell their full story, and then go back later and fill in the details. And the way that I do this on a really concrete level is that in my note-taking, I start by drawing a line right down the center of my page. And so if someone wants to start with their story, and not everybody will do that, some folks will give you a little information and you have to kind of go back and forth. But if you're getting a full story, I'm writing all that down, and on the right-hand column I'll even jot down little questions that I want to come back to later. But to allow someone to tell their whole story and then go back and fill in details later. And what happens more commonly, and I've seen this even in transcripts and as well as in interactions, is that someone might be in the middle of recounting a traumatic incident, and someone will say, oh wait, what year were you married? And so there's a lot of reasons that might happen. There might also be stuff that's coming up for us in our interaction with that person that we need to take a break from what it is that they're telling us. But often it's that kind of interruption can interrupt a person's best chance at having a full memory of telling us what we need to know to prepare for their court proceeding. And so ideally, as much as time allows, we're going to let them tell their story and then go back and fill in details later by asking questions. And part of being able to do this really is increasing our comfort with different ways of communicating, but also increasing our comfort just with the silence, just with the moments of silence that can happen over the course of telling a story, that we not always feeling like we need to push through or move forward in a quick way, that sometimes we can sit with moments of silence and allow people to decide the cadence of how they want their story to unfold. We can increase our comfort also with things not necessarily fully making sense the first time that someone tells us about them, that we can hold not fully understanding what it is that they're telling us until we have a moment to go back in and fill in those details later. And we're really seeing all of this as a work in progress. And on that note, one important part of this, I think about this as trying to leave the door open. So if I meet with someone and maybe I've gotten a lot of information from them, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of what their concerns are and what it is that we're going to be working on together. I will nonetheless say at the end of an interview, I'll say, I often find that people think of something later that they didn't tell me in the first meeting for a number of reasons, one of which is that, we just met, and I'm committed to building a good relationship with you, and I'm committed to putting time into that and building your trust. But I know that we just met, and I know that there may be things that maybe you just didn't think of, or maybe you didn't feel comfortable sharing with me, or for whatever reason didn't mention to me today. And I just want you to know that if you think of those things later, or if you think of things later that you want to share with me, that you can do that. And we can talk about that at a second meeting or a third meeting, even if the things that you tell me are a little bit different from what you tell me today. And the reason I do that is because I find that you'll get some of that information on your second or third meeting and not a year later when you're at that hearing. You're allowing some space for those things to come up and those things to change, and you're leaving that door open for that to happen. So I'm going to go, this is my shortest scenario, and then maybe we'll look at a couple of these questions here that are coming up. So finally, I just want to talk for just a couple moments, just in our last, I'll just take maybe 10 more minutes here for this, of the shortest scenarios. Sometimes the person that we're working with is extremely upset. And this can look like a lot of different things. Maybe they're angry, or they're just feeling themselves very unsafe, or for whatever reason you feel that you want to offer to help that person come back to a place of calm. And so we're still taking this two-step analysis of first thinking about what could be happening from their perspective. And I just want to define emotional crisis, or at least move in the direction of explaining emotional crisis with you all. And if you guys have thoughts about this too, feel free to add them into the chat box. Whether something is an emotional crisis, first of all, most importantly, is a subjective experience. So we can notice that someone may be feeling in a way that we're wondering if they need some support, and we can notice that to those folks, and we can state our commitment to wanting to support them if in fact they do want support around that. But it's really only the person themselves who can decide if they're in an emotional crisis. It's not our discomfort with what's going on, certainly, that makes something an emotional crisis. But we may say, in the direction of a definition on that, we may say that someone is experiencing an emotional crisis if they cannot get to where they want to be, if they can't get to where they want to be emotionally without external support. So there's something about what's coming up for them that's it's difficult to manage, or to come back to perhaps a state of calm perhaps a state of peace that they want to be in without having some kind of external support, for example, from another person. But importantly, experiencing emotional crisis is not the same as experiencing symptoms of a mental health condition. So those are not two equal things. Those are not one and the same. So we'll talk for a moment about what might help. At a real concrete level, talk a little bit about body posture. So some of the things that can be helpful. Again, remembering that our body posture our body is one of the ways that we communicate. Our body language communicates. And so this is a long list of things that we'll go over here in just a second. But I think the important thing I want to say about this is that it's not just a random list, right? So when any of us are experiencing emotional crisis, it's because something's not right in the world. It's because something's not right, or something's not okay, or something's not safe in the world. And so the primary thing that we're trying to do in both our physical communication and in our verbal communication is to communicate safety and communicate our commitment to making that person feel safe. So it's not a random list. It's actually things that we are hopeful will contribute to a sense of safety and control on the part of the person who's having that experience. And it's the absence of cues that there might be potential for conflict or potential of violence in the interaction. So we're taking those out of the environment to the extent that we can. Does that make sense? So with our body posture, we can sit at a slight angle to someone, so not sort of squared shoulder to shoulder or head on, and we're not towering over the person, right? We're sitting at a relaxed slight angle to that person. We're not, and this is sort of a general rule, touching anyone ever without consent, so we never want to do that. We don't want to block exits, so if a person needs to get to the exit, they can. We don't want to find ourselves in a position where we're between them and the door. We're not crowding them. And we're using gentle eye contact, so not staring at someone, but also not looking away. And someone mentioned earlier in the chat box about being sincere, and we can be sincere in our eye contact as well. So we're just using gentle and relaxed eye contact to let someone know that we're there and we're present with them, and we're focused on them, and we care about what's happening, and we're not trying to intimidate them in any kind of way. Open body language includes not crossing your arms or putting your hands on your hips, keeping your hands out of your pockets as well. Avoid abrupt movements, and then we're just modeling breathing and just relaxing. Yeah, and this is a helpful comments here. Yeah, we'll go back to those in just a second. Just some points on verbal communication. We're going to speak slowly, and we're going to use short sentences, so not long and complex sentences, but really just focusing on short sentences. For example, I want to listen to you. Can you speak slowly? Or just, I hear you. Or just, yes, I know you're scared. Yes, that sounds scary. Or I'm really glad that you're telling me about this. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay here and work with you. I think we can try together. I think we can decide together what to do. So we're going to speak calmly, not raise our voice. And as really the first step of what we're trying to do is just establish a reconnection with that person. And second to that, thinking about what our next step could be together. And if it's necessary, obviously we can ask maybe colleagues or others for their help. I just want to note this important piece of this as well. So people who are in emotional crisis or experiencing mental health symptoms, either of these things, are often in our world not believed, are not found to be credible, or they're treated dismissively. Their experiences of violence are treated dismissively. And this is true even though that we know violent experiences often precede folks having emotional crisis or folks having a lot of mental health symptoms come up. However, in domestic violence work, we know that unbelievable things are sometimes true. And so I created a little bit of material, most of which I didn't include here, but as part of a separate module in response to some questions that came from the domestic violence advocates here in Chicago, where we have a whole courthouse that just does we have a specialized domestic violence courthouse here in the city. And among other things that were coming up for them, they were having folks come into the courthouse saying that they were having experiences that the advocates there found hard to believe. And they were a really great bunch of advocates who wanted to support folks both in their needs around domestic violence and connect them with regard to other needs in their lives. But they were saying we're really having a hard time figuring out how to do that and how to do that in a trauma-informed way, because folks are coming in and we can tell that they're scared, and we know that they're scared, and they're perhaps telling us that they want an order of protection and perhaps not, but the kinds of experiences they're talking about are experiences that are hard to believe, such as that it's actually a celebrity that's following them, for example. Or they're saying folks are coming in and it seems like they're hearing voices that other people can't hear. And so it's complicated, right? So from a domestic violence perspective, we know that unbelievable things are sometimes true, but we also know that even when those things may not be true in the way that we usually think about them, it may be that something else scary like that has happened or is happening right now. And so it makes it really complicated to think about how we can support someone who's having experiences that we might not fully understand. So I just want to give a couple of pointers that I pulled over from that other set of materials on responding to these folks who are trying to access service through the DV courthouse here in Chicago. Just some tips if you're working with someone who might be hearing voices that other people don't hear. And all of these suggestions come from folks with lived experience on this topic. First of all, just to invite that person to a quieter space, to use their name if you know it. If you don't know it, you can try asking it. If you know that person's name, you can try that. Responding to if someone's having a lot of speech and maybe seems a little disorganized, you can respond to that just by using slow, clear, short sentences, speaking clearly and slowly. You can repeat yourself as seems helpful, always obviously doing this sincerely and with respect in a way that's intended to be helpful and certainly not patronizing. But to the extent it seems helpful to repeat things that you've said, you can do that using all of our body language tips that we learned from the earlier slide. Don't assume that someone can't understand you or they're not hearing you just because they're not responding. They might be able to take it in but not necessarily to respond. And of course, always we're going to communicate to folks with hope and with genuine respect. Things we'll never do in our role as legal advocates and attorneys is to challenge a person's belief or say something is not real. We'll certainly never make fun of someone, and also to be careful about communicating disbelief or things like that in other ways, such as rolling your eyes, and certainly we're not going to be playing along and acting like we believe that something is real if it's not part of our experience. So some of the language around this that we'll just model is you can say that you feel concerned about what's going on. You can say that, you know, the thing that they're talking about isn't something that you have a lot of experience with. I don't know much about that, but I know some people that do. And you can provide references or referrals if someone is open to that. It's also okay to ask if someone is hearing voices. Are you hearing voices right now? And are they making it hard for you to focus or to concentrate? And would you prefer to move to a quieter area so that maybe we can communicate a little better? Also just asking if you've ever been worried about that before, and if you were, if anything helped when you were feeling that way. And so today I just wanted to walk through those couple of really basic introductory scenarios to our work. But what I'd really like to do is invite all of you to continue working with us on this project of how we take a trauma-informed social justice approach specifically to our legal advocacy work. Certainly an iterative process, both to build out that framework and to put together our, what I think about as like a toolbox of all of these different ways that we can be responding to someone who we're both supporting in the context of a legal proceeding, but we also want to be responsive to what might be coming up for them around trauma and around domestic violence. That's really the project of the trauma-informed legal advocacy work. And so if you go to our website, we've got a page on trauma-informed legal advocacy, and there's some of these scenarios and some scenarios that I wasn't able to cover today are there, and you can get a good sense of what some of those resources look like, and also these workshops around worksheets around preparing someone for a court proceeding are available on our website as well. But I'm really curious to hear from you. As I mentioned, all of the scenarios that I've done and all of the questions here, they all came from folks working in the field, so from legal advocates and attorneys, DV advocates working at courthouses, attorneys working with survivors in custody cases, folks asking me questions about how we really get concrete about applying trauma-informed social justice approach specifically to legal advocacy work. And so if you have questions or you have suggestions for other scenarios or you have ideas about things to add to the scenarios, I very much invite you to work with me on this project. I'm excited to continue building it out. So we've got about 2 minutes. I'll put it also up. That's my email where you can reach me. That's my phone number, and that's our website. And we've also got the link to the TILA page right there, so that you can visit that as you leave. I think you're also going to get an evaluation when you close out of this box. So if you could give us some feedback on the webinar today. Thanks, folks, for saying that was helpful. I'll read a couple of these other comments that folks added that seem really helpful here. Someone says, as an advocate, we not only advocate with clients, but also with the attorneys too, and that this will be helpful. Great, with DAs. Great, that's excellent. Yeah, advocates, I think advocates and attorneys working together, everybody has a lot to teach each other, so that's really good to hear. Also, we had a suggestion here to check out Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who's got some videos on YouTube, and she does some training geared toward law enforcement regarding trauma and its impact on survivors. Yeah, so that's good as well. So thank you all so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate having your time. I look forward to hearing from you. I'd really like to hear about what's coming up for you and your work, and how we can create more materials and really support you in the work that you're doing. Jen, did you have anything close out?
Yeah, this is Erin again. Thanks so much. I'd like to thank Rachel for such an exceptional webinar today, and thank you also to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning. Thank you to Jen Curley for making our webinar run so smoothly as always. And thank you, all of you participants, for spending your time with us today at the center. Within the next week or so, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts that were referenced, all of which will also be available on our website. And in addition to that, you all will receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, as soon as you close out the windows, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, we would really, really appreciate it. And thank you all so much, and we hope you have a great afternoon.